The three blonde girls in matching blue dresses did the same thing every afternoon. 5 years old, identical triplets, each one clutching a lunchbox they'd never open. Because every single day, they walked straight past the cafeteria tables and handed those lunchboxes to the elderly school janitor. Their father noticed the pattern. He followed them. What he discovered wasn't a simple act of kindness. It was a secret that had been waiting 30 years, hidden in a worn photograph the janitor kept in his breast pocket, folded like a prayer. The father's name was Daniel Turner, a widower for 3 years, raising three daughters alone in a quiet neighborhood outside Cleveland. Every morning he packed three identical lunches. Every afternoon his triplets came home with empty lunchboxes and full hearts, telling him about their friend, the janitor who swept their hallways and told them stories about the ocean. Daniel thought it was sweet, until he noticed the lunches weren't coming back empty. They were coming back untouched. His daughters were giving away every single meal. When he asked why, they said the janitor needed it more than they did. But the question that would change everything wasn't why the man needed food. It was why he started crying the moment he saw their mother's photograph tucked inside the lunchbox lid. Daniel stood in the empty school hallway, the janitor's tears still wet on the worn linoleum floor. The man's name was Henry Burke. He had been cleaning this school for 12 years, and in all that time no one had ever asked about the photograph he kept in his breast pocket, until now. Daniel held the lunchbox in one hand and the photograph in the other. It was his wife, Emily, but younger, maybe 22, standing on a beach with her hair tangled in sea wind. The same photograph that had sat on their nightstand for 7 years, the one he had framed after the funeral. The one his daughters had never seen because he kept it in his closet, too painful to display. Henry had known her. The question was how. Daniel sat on a stack of folded chairs while Henry collected himself. The school had gone quiet. The last bus had pulled away 20 minutes ago. In the distance, the fluorescent lights hummed like a confession waiting to happen. Henry spoke first. He said, "I'm not supposed to be here." He meant the school, but also the world. Henry was 63 years old. He had been a janitor at 3 different schools over 28 years. Before that, he had worked construction. Before that, he had spent 6 years in prison. He told Daniel this like it was a grocery list, flat and rehearsed. He had learned long ago that the truth came out eventually, better to control how it landed. Daniel didn't ask about the prison, not yet. He pointed at the photograph instead. "How do you know my wife?" Henry's hands shook as he placed the lunchbox on the floor. "Your wife," he repeated like he was tasting the words. "She was my daughter." Daniel's first instinct was denial. Emily had never mentioned a father. She had said her parents died in a car accident when she was 19. She had shown him a gravestone once at a cemetery in Ohio, 2 names on one stone. She had cried and he had held her, and that was the end of it. "You're lying," Daniel said. Henry didn't blink. "Ask her mother. She's been gone 14 years now, but she knew. She's the one who told me to stay away." The story came out in pieces like a puzzle missing edges. Henry had been 24 when Emily was born. He and her mother, Margaret, were newly married and broke. Henry had a drug problem, a felony record, and no future. When Emily was 6 months old, Margaret's parents stepped in. They had money. They offered to raise Emily as their own, to give her a stable life, a college fund, a future without a father who might relapse and ruin everything. Henry agreed. He signed away his parental rights. He walked out of the hospital and did not look back. For 37 years he kept the promise. He stayed away. He sent money when he could, anonymously. He watched from a distance. He knew Emily had graduated from college. He knew she married a man named Daniel. He knew she had triplets. He knew she died. He found out about the funeral 3 weeks after it happened. He had been in the hospital recovering from a heart attack. He missed it. He said he grieved alone in his small apartment with a photograph he had kept hidden in a shoe box for decades. The same photograph Daniel now held. "Why didn't you reach out?" Daniel asked. His voice was quiet, but the hallway carried it. Henry looked at his hands. "Because I didn't deserve to." The triplets had started giving him lunches 8 months ago. They called him Mr. Henry. They told him their mommy was in heaven. They asked if he had a mommy. He said yes, but she was gone too. They asked if he was lonely. He said sometimes. They said that's why they shared their lunch, because no one should eat alone. Henry had not told them the truth. He said he didn't have the heart. But the day he saw Emily's photograph taped to the inside of the lunchbox lid, something broke. The triplets had done it themselves. They had found the photograph in Daniel's closet and slipped it in without telling him. A gift for their friend, a piece of their mother. Daniel had not known about the photograph until he opened the lunchbox that afternoon. He had been searching for answers. He found a ghost instead. "I want you to meet them," Daniel said. "Properly." Henry shook his head. "I can't. You're their grandfather. I'm a janitor with a record and a heart condition. I'm not what they need." Daniel stood up. The photograph was still in his hand. "You're what they've got." But Henry had one more secret. One that would change everything Daniel thought he knew about his wife. One that had nothing to do with adoption or estrangement and everything to do with how Emily had died. Daniel stared at Henry, the photograph still trembling in his hand. "What do you mean how she died? She had a stroke. The doctors said it was a brain aneurysm. Nothing could have been done." Henry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "That's what they told you. That's what they told everyone. But I was there, Daniel. I was in the hospital that night." The words landed like a punch. Daniel stepped back. "You were there, you saw her." Henry nodded slowly. "I've been watching her for years, from a distance. I knew she was pregnant. I knew she had the bobbies. I knew her address. I knew her doctor's name. I never got close. I just needed to know she was okay. But the night she was admitted, I was in the emergency room for my own heart. I saw her name on the board. I walked to her room. I stood outside the door for 3 hours. Why didn't you go in? Because I was a coward." Henry's voice cracked. "Because I didn't know what to say, because I thought she'd be scared, because I thought she'd hate me, so I stood there and then she code blue. I watched them try to save her for 40 minutes. I watched them fail." Daniel sank onto the stack of chairs. His legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "You watched her die. I watched them take her body away. I watched them call your name over the intercom. I heard you run down the hall. I slipped out the side door before you saw me. I've carried that night with me every day since." Daniel's mind raced. His wife had died alone in a hospital room while her estranged father stood outside. The father she never knew existed. The father who had chosen to stay away. The father who now cleaned her children's school for minimum wage. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because your daughters put that photograph in my lunchbox. Because they gave me a piece of her when I didn't deserve it, because I'm tired of carrying this alone." Daniel stood up. His hands were shaking. "You could have been in her life. She could have known her father. She would have known a drug addict with a record who abandoned her. I gave her the only gift I could, a clean slate. That wasn't your choice to make. It was the only choice I had." The conversation died there. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere in the building, a custodian's mop bucket clanked. Daniel looked at the photograph again. Emily was smiling in it, her whole life ahead of her. And at the edge of the frame, barely visible, was a shadow, a man's silhouette. Henry standing behind the photographer, watching his daughter from a distance. He had been there all along. Daniel asked the question that had been forming since the first tear fell. "Did Emily know? Did she know you existed?" Henry hesitated. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. It was yellow, the paper soft as cloth. "She wrote me a letter 6 weeks before she died." Daniel took the envelope. The return address was his own house. The letter was addressed to Henry Burke at a P.O. box in Toledo. Daniel had never seen it before. "When did you get this?" "A week after the funeral. It was forwarded from the P.O. box." "Why didn't you show me?" "Because what she wrote was for me. But now you need to read it." Daniel opened the envelope. The letter was written on notebook paper in Emily's familiar handwriting. The handwriting that had signed birthday cards and grocery lists. The handwriting that had written his name on a wedding certificate. He read it silently. "Dad, if you're reading this, I know who you are. I've known for years. Mom told me before she died. She said you made a choice to protect me. She said you loved me. I don't know if that's true, but I have 3 daughters now and I want them to know what love really means. I'm not angry. I just want a chance to meet you, to say thank you, to tell you that I turned out okay. I'm a mother. I have a good husband. I'm happy. Please write back or call or show up. I'll be waiting. Emily." Daniel's hands dropped to his lap, the words blurred. She knew about you and she wanted to meet you." Henry nodded, tears streaming down his face. "And I never responded. I was too scared, too ashamed. I told myself it was too late. I told myself she was better off without me. I buried the letter in a shoebox and I didn't pull it out again until the night she died. Daniel looked from the letter to the photograph to the man in front of him. The janitor, the father, the ghost. We need to tell the girls. Henry shook his head violently. No, no, Daniel, they're 5 years old. They don't need to know their grandfather is a felon who abandoned their grandmother. They don't need to know I watched their mother die. They don't need that weight. They deserve the truth. The truth will break them. Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it in his wallet. The truth already broke me, but they're stronger than you think. They're Emily's daughters. That night, Daniel drove home with the lunchbox on the passenger seat. The triplets were already asleep, tucked in by the babysitter. He sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the photograph, at the shadow at the edge of the frame, at the ghost who had been watching all along. He thought about all the times he had felt observed, all the moments when he had turned around and seen no one, all the coincidences. The school janitor being assigned to this specific building 2 years after Emily's death. The fact that Henry had requested this school. The fact that he had been transferred here from across the district. Henry had followed them, not to intrude but to be near, to sweep his daughter's children's floors, to hear their laughter, to pretend he was part of their world. And now Daniel had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The triplets had already formed a bond with Mr. Henry. They loved him. They trusted him. They gave him their lunches. And he had loved them from the shadows for 3 years, never daring to touch, never daring to call himself their grandfather. The next morning, Daniel called the school district. He asked for Henry Burke's personnel file. What he found there would turn the story in a direction no one expected. Something that had nothing to do with drug addiction or abandonment. Something that involved a six-figure donation, a sealed court record, and a promise Emily had made 30 years ago without knowing it. The personnel file arrived by fax at Daniel's office the next morning. 11 pages. Employment history, performance reviews, a letter of commendation from the previous principal. Nothing unusual. But attached to the back was a notice from the district's legal department. A sealed document, referenced by case number, dating back 30 years. Daniel called the district's records office. He was told the file was restricted by court order. He drove to the county courthouse that afternoon. The clerk found the case in the archives. Family court, sealed, signed by a judge who retired 15 years ago. Daniel paid the fee to request unsealing. He cited a pending family matter involving a minor. The clerk said it would take 3 to 5 business days. Daniel couldn't wait. He called his brother-in-law, a lawyer in Columbus, who made a few calls. By 6 o'clock that evening, Daniel had a digital copy of the file on his phone. He read it in the courthouse parking lot. The document was a settlement agreement between Henry Burke and Margaret's parents, signed in a county courthouse in Pennsylvania. The terms were straightforward. Henry would relinquish all parental rights to Emily Margaret Burke. In exchange, Margaret's parents would deposit $200,000 into a trust fund for Emily's education and medical expenses. Henry would receive no money directly. He would have no visitation. He would not contact the child. If he violated any term, the trust would be void, and the full amount would be donated to a charity of the grandparents' choosing. But there was a second clause, buried on page 7. It stated that if Henry never violated the agreement, and if Emily reached the age of 25 without attempting to contact him, the trust would automatically convert to a personal account in Henry's name. $200,000 plus accrued interest payable to Henry Burke on Emily's 25th birthday. Daniel did the math. Emily died at 29. She would have turned 25 5 years after the agreement was signed. That meant for 20 years a trust fund had been growing in Henry's name and he had never touched it. He had never violated the agreement. He had stayed away. And then when Emily turned 25, the money became his, but he hadn't taken it. Was still working as a janitor, making $26,000 a year. Daniel called Henry that night. The trust fund, you knew about it. Henry's voice was tired. I knew. You never claimed it. I didn't deserve it. That money could have changed your life. It would have changed nothing. The only thing I ever wanted was to know my daughter. That trust fund was the price of never knowing her. Taking the money would have meant accepting that price. I couldn't. Daniel sat down at his kitchen table. Triplets were asleep upstairs. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. "There's something else in the file," he said. "A letter from Emily's mother to you." Henry was silent for a long moment. "What letter?" "It's dated 6 months after the agreement was signed. It says she's sorry. It says she hopes you forgive her. It says she's keeping her promise." "What promise?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. The letter doesn't say. It just says the promise we made when she was born." Henry's breath caught. "When she was born, I remember. Margaret was holding Emily in the hospital. She looked at me and said, 'I promise you, Henry, she'll know you were real. She'll know you loved her.' I thought she meant she'd tell Emily about me one day, but she never did." "Maybe she tried," Daniel said. "Maybe the letter was her way of keeping the promise. She wrote it. She sent it to the court. She filed it with the agreement. She wanted it on record. But Emily never knew. Not until her mother told her on her deathbed. That's when Emily wrote to you. That's when she tried to find you." Henry's voice broke. "And I didn't answer. I broke the promise, not Margaret, me." Daniel looked at the photograph of Emily on his mantle. She was smiling, holding one of the triplets as a newborn. "You didn't break it, Henry. You protected it. You stayed away so she could have the trust fund. You stayed away so she could have a clean life. You stayed away because you loved her. Loving her from a distance doesn't make me a father. Being there when she needed you doesn't make you a saint either, but showing up now, for her daughters, that might be the closest thing to redemption you'll ever get." The next morning, Daniel told the triplets they were going to have breakfast with Mr. Henry, not at school, but at a diner. The girls were ecstatic. They put on their matching blue dresses without being asked. They drew pictures to give him. They asked if Mr. Henry liked pancakes. At the diner, Henry was already waiting in a booth, wearing a clean button-down shirt instead of his uniform. He looked nervous. He had brought a small gift bag for each girl. The triplets ran to him. "Mr. Henry, Mr. Henry." He hugged them one by one. His eyes were wet. "I have something to tell you," he said. "Something important." The girls looked at Daniel, who nodded. Henry took a deep breath. "You know how you gave me your lunches because you thought I needed them?" They nodded. "I did need them, but not for the reason you think. I needed them because every time you handed me that lunchbox, I felt like your mama was handing it to me, because your mama was my daughter." The triplets stared at him. The youngest, Lily, tilted her head. "You're our mommy's daddy," Henry's voice cracked. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm your grandfather." Lily climbed onto his lap. "Then why don't you live with us?" "Because I was scared, because I made mistakes. Because I didn't think I deserved to be your grandfather." "But you gave us piggyback rides," Lily said, "and you let us help you sweep, and you ate our sandwiches even though they had crusts." Henry laughed through his tears. "I did. So you were already our grandfather, you just didn't say it." At that moment, the waitress brought the pancakes. The triplets dug in, oblivious to the weight of the revelation. But Henry and Daniel sat in silence, watching them. The promise Margaret made 30 years ago had finally been kept. Not through a letter, not through a trust fund. Through 3 little girls in blue dresses who had decided on their own to feed the man who had been invisible for too long. The next week, Henry did something no one expected. He went to the bank and closed the trust fund account that had been sitting untouched for years. $200,000 plus interest totaled nearly $400,000. He walked into the principal's office and donated every cent of it to the school district's fund for support staff. He requested that the money be used to provide meals, emergency housing assistance, and health care for janitors, cafeteria workers, and bus drivers. He asked that the program be named the Emily Burke Food and Care Fund. The principal asked why. Henry said, "Because my daughter always wanted to help the people no one sees, and I spent my whole life being invisible. It's time to be seen." The school district accepted the donation. The program launched 3 months later. Henry kept his job as a janitor. He said he wasn't ready to retire. He had grandchildren to watch grow up, and he had lunchboxes to accept. The Emily Burke Food and Care Fund launched at the start of the next school year. The program provided breakfast and lunch to any support staff member who needed it, offered emergency grants for rent and medical bills, and built a network of volunteer teachers who covered shifts so employees could attend appointments. Within 6 months, the fund had helped over 40 janitors, cafeteria workers, and bus drivers across the district. Henry Burke personally served every single meal in the cafeteria during the first week. He stood behind the counter, wearing his usual uniform, spooning out scrambled eggs and saying, "Take what you need." It's from my daughter. The triplets visited him every day at lunch. They no longer brought their own lunches because they ate with him in the cafeteria now. Daniel watched from the door sometimes, watching his daughters laugh with a man who had spent 37 years in the shadows. He thought about the letter Emily wrote. He thought about the trust fund. He thought about the photograph at the edge of the frame. And he realized that Henry had been part of their lives longer than anyone knew. He had been the ghost who fixed their sink, the shadow who left flowers on Emily's grave on her birthday, the stranger who transferred to this school because he knew Daniel had enrolled the triplets. One night, Henry asked Daniel to meet him at the school after hours. The building was dark except for a single light in the janitor's closet. Henry was packing his tools into a box. "I'm leaving," he said. Daniel's heart sank. "Where are you going?" "Nowhere. I'm just not working here anymore. The fund needs a full-time director. The district offered me the job. I turned it down twice, but they said they'd name the position after Emily only if I took it. I can't let her name be attached to something that fails, so I'm taking it." Daniel didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You're becoming the director of the program you funded." "I'm becoming the person I should have been 30 years ago." Henry packed his last mop and looked around the closet. "I started this job because I wanted to be near Emily's children, but the triplets already have a father. They don't need me in the hallway. They need me to build something that matters, something that says her life meant more than a photograph in my pocket." Daniel put his hand on Henry's shoulder. "She'd be proud of you. She'd be proud of you too. You raised those girls to give their lunch to a stranger. That's not something you teach. That's something they caught from watching you." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Henry picked up his box and walked out of the closet for the last time. The next morning, the triplets arrived at school to find a sign on the janitor's closet door. It read, "Mr. Henry has a new job. He'll still visit. Keep sharing your snacks with everyone." They were confused at first, but that afternoon a limousine pulled up to the school. Henry stepped out wearing a suit. He took the triplets for ice cream and explained that he was now the director of something called the Emily Fund. "Why does it have Mommy's name?" Lily asked. "Because your mommy was the kindest person I ever knew," Henry said. "And this fund is going to be kind to a lot of people, just like she would have wanted. But you're still our grandfather, right? Forever." 3 weeks later, the district held a ceremony for the fund. The triplets stood on stage with Henry while the mayor cut a ribbon. Daniel watched from the front row, holding a framed photograph of Emily, the same photograph from the lunchbox, the one with the shadow at the edge. After the ceremony, an elderly woman approached Henry. She was frail, supported by a cane, with silver hair pinned neatly. She introduced herself as Margaret's childhood best friend. She had been the one who mailed the letter to the court all those years ago, and she had one more thing to give him. She handed Henry a small envelope. "Margaret asked me to give this to you when the time was right. She said you'd know when." Henry opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note dated 1 week before Margaret's death. It said, "Henry, I kept my promise. I told Emily about you before I died. She wanted to meet you. I told her to wait until she was ready. I hope you find each other. Please forgive me. Margaret." Henry looked up. The woman was gone. He turned to Daniel, the note trembling in his hands. "She knew. Margaret knew Emily would try to find me. She kept the promise. She told her." Daniel nodded. "And Emily wrote to you. You just never got the letter until after she was gone." That night, Daniel and Henry sat on the front porch of Daniel's house. The triplets were asleep inside. The stars were out. Henry held the note and the letter and the photograph. "Now I have all of her," he said. "A letter she wrote, a note her mother wrote, a photograph of her on a beach, and 3 girls who look exactly like her." "You have a legacy too," Daniel said. "The fund, the families you're helping, that's her legacy too." Henry folded the papers and placed them in a small metal box he had brought. Inside were already hundreds of letters, drawings, and notes from the triplets. "I spent my whole life telling myself I didn't deserve to be seen. But those girls saw me anyway. They saw a tired old man in a uniform and decided he mattered. That's not something I earned. That's something they gave me." "That's what family does," Daniel said. Henry laughed softly. "I don't know what I am to them. A grandfather who showed up late, a stranger who watched their mother die, a janitor who couldn't save anyone. You're the man who gave up $400,000 so no janitor in this district ever has to choose between food and rent." You're the man who stood outside a hospital room because he was too scared to go in. You're the man who spent 2 years sweeping the same hallway as his grandchildren just to hear their voices. That's not nothing, that's everything. Henry was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "One more thing I never told you." Daniel waited. "The night Emily died, I didn't just stand outside the door. I went in, after they called the code, after they stopped. I went in and I held her hand. I told her I was sorry. I told her daughters were beautiful. I told her I loved her. She was gone. She couldn't hear me, but I said it anyway. I said it for 37 years of silence." Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just sat there on the porch of the house where his wife had lived and died, next to the father she had never known, while their grandchildren slept inside. The stars didn't change. The night didn't answer. But for the first time in 37 years, Henry Burke felt like he belonged somewhere. That night on the porch, something shifted that couldn't be undone. Henry Burke had spent 37 years invisible, and in the span of a few months, 3 little girls in blue dresses had pulled him into the light. Not through cleverness, not through pity, through lunchboxes, through the simple, unbreakable habit of sharing what they had with someone who had nothing. The Emily Burke Food and Care Fund now operates in 12 school districts across 3 states. It has served over 70,000 meals to custodial staff, bus drivers, and cafeteria workers. It has paid for surgery for a janitor's wife. It has kept a bus driver from eviction. And every year on the anniversary of Emily's death, Henry Burke takes the triplets to the cemetery. They leave a packed lunch on her grave. They tell her about the people her name has helped. Because the real story here is not about a janitor who turned out to be a grandfather. The real story is about how many invisible people walk through our hallways every single day. People with entire lives, entire histories, entire griefs. People who clean our floors and serve our food and drive our children to school, and who might be holding a photograph in their pocket that would break your heart if you only knew. The triplets taught us something we already know but keep forgetting. That kindness is not complicated. It does not require a plan. It just requires paying attention, seeing the person everyone else looks past, handing them your lunch. What they did for Henry Burke, they did without knowing who he was. They gave to a stranger, and that stranger turned out to be family. But even if he had not been their grandfather, he would still have been hungry. He would still have been lonely. He would still have needed someone to see him. The question this story leaves us with is not whether you would feed a janitor. It is how many people you walk past every day who are carrying a secret that would change everything about how you see them. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you passed in the hallway today, do not wait. Look up. Say hello. Share what you have. You never know whose photograph is folded inside their pocket, and you never know whose father might be sweeping your floor. Subscribe for more stories that remind us why we are all connected. Click the screen to watch the next one.